You sit at a long wooden table in a room with no windows. The air is thick with dust that makes your lungs burn. Your fingers are bleeding from small cuts that never heal because you make the same motions hundreds of times every day. You are surrounded by others doing the exact same work. No one speaks. There is no time to speak. The supervisor walks between the rows, watching, counting, making sure no one slows down. Your back aches. Your hands cramp. Your eyes strain in the dim lamplight. But you cannot stop. You cannot complain. Because if you do, you will be replaced immediately. There are a dozen people waiting outside right now who would take your job without hesitation. And if you lose this job, your children do not eat tonight. Your wife does not eat. Your elderly parents do not eat. So you keep your head down. You keep working. You swallow the pain, the exhaustion, the humiliation, because refusing is not an option. This was the brutal reality in industrial Britain and America throughout the 18 and early 1900s, an era when economic survival depended entirely on wage labor and there were no safety nets. No unemployment benefits, no welfare, no food assistance. If you did not work, you did not eat. And if you had a family depending on you, their survival rested entirely on your ability to keep working no matter what the job demanded. This created a system where employers held absolute power. They could impose any conditions, any hours, any wages, because workers had no leverage. One of the most exploitative jobs during this period was piece-rate sewing and textile work, particularly in sweatshops and home-based piecework systems. Thousands of families, especially immigrant families, worked from dawn until midnight sewing garments, assembling products, or completing repetitive tasks for payment calculated per piece rather than per hour. The work destroyed hands, eyes, and spines, but refusing meant watching your family starve. His name was Jacob. He was 34 years old and worked as a tailor in a cramped tenement workshop in New York City. He had immigrated from Eastern Europe 5 years earlier with his wife and 3 children, hoping for a better life. Instead, he found himself trapped in a system designed to extract maximum labor for minimum pay. Jacob had skills. He had been a tailor in his home country, but in America those skills meant nothing without connections or capital. He could not afford to open his own shop. He could not join the established tailoring guilds that controlled the best jobs. His only option was piecework. A contractor supplied him with cut fabric and patterns. Jacob's job was to sew the pieces together into finished coats. He was paid per coat. The rate was so low that he had to complete at least 15 coats a day just to earn enough for food and rent. That meant working 18 hours a day, every day, with no breaks, no rest, no time for anything except sewing. Jacob's hands never stopped moving. He woke at 4 in the morning and immediately began working at the table in the corner of the single room where his family lived. His wife worked beside him, doing simpler stitching and button work. His 2 oldest children, ages 10 and 12, helped after school and worked all day on weekends. Even his youngest, barely 7, was taught to thread needles and trim loose threads. The entire family worked as a unit because one person alone could not produce enough to survive. Jacob's fingers were covered in calluses and scars from needle pricks and fabric cuts. His back was permanently bent from hunching over the table. His eyes were failing from working in dim light for endless hours. But he could not stop. Every morning, he calculated how many coats he needed to finish that day to pay rent, buy food, and have a few pennies left over. And every morning, the number felt impossible. But he did it anyway because the alternative was eviction and starvation. The work itself was mind-numbing and physically destructive. Jacob repeated the same stitching patterns thousands of times. The fabric was often heavy wool that required constant pressure to push the needle through. His hands cramped so severely that he sometimes could not straighten his fingers. He developed chronic pain in his wrists and forearms. His shoulders ached constantly from the hunched position. The dust from the fabric filled the room and made everyone cough. His youngest child had developed a persistent lung problem that Jacob could not afford to treat, but the work continued. The contractor delivered new fabric every few days and collected the finished coats. He paid Jacob, deducting fees for materials and alleged defects. The payment was always less than Jacob expected. The contractor controlled everything. If Jacob complained, the contractor would simply stop giving him work and find another desperate family. So Jacob said nothing. He just took the money, however little it was, and kept sewing. Jacob stopped existing as a person. He became a sewing machine in human form. His entire identity was reduced to productivity. He did not have hobbies. He did not have friends. He did not have time to play with his children or talk to his wife about anything except work quotas and survival calculations. He lost weight because he often gave his portions of food to his children. He aged rapidly. His hair went gray. His face became gaunt and hollow. He looked 50 but was only in his 30s. And he knew what he was doing to his family. His children should have been in school full-time, learning, playing, being children. Instead, they were hunched over needles, their childhood stolen by economic necessity. His wife should have had a life beyond endless stitching, but none of them had choices. They were trapped in a system that demanded everything and gave almost nothing in return. The other families in the building were living the same nightmare. Jacob heard them through the thin walls, the sound of sewing machines and needles and scissors, the sound of children crying from exhaustion, the sound of arguments about money that never stretched far enough. Everyone was drowning. Everyone was working themselves to death, and no one could help each other because everyone was barely surviving themselves. There was no community, no solidarity, just isolated families grinding themselves down in parallel silence. Think about this. Imagine being forced to choose between your own health and your children's survival. Imagine knowing that taking a single day off to rest, to heal, to recover, could mean your family goes hungry. Could you make that choice? And what kind of system creates conditions where that choice even exists? The dangers went far beyond exhaustion. Jacob's workspace was a fire trap. The building was old and poorly maintained. It was packed with families, all working with open flames from oil lamps and candles. Fabric and thread were everywhere. One spark could ignite the entire building. Jacob thought about this every day but had nowhere else to go. Then it happened. A building 3 blocks away, nearly identical to his, caught fire during the night. 23 people died, including entire families trapped in upper floors with no fire escapes. The doors had been locked from the outside by a landlord trying to prevent theft. People burned to death or jumped from windows. Jacob heard about it the next morning. He sat at his table, looked at his sleeping children, and felt a wave of terror. But he kept working because what else could he do? He could not afford to move. He could not afford to stop working. So he just lived with the fear and hoped it would not happen to him. Jacob also lived with the constant threat of injury. Sewing needles broke and stabbed through fingers. Scissors slipped and cut deep. Infections were common because there was no time to properly clean wounds. Jacob's wife developed a severe infection in her thumb from a needle puncture. Her entire hand swelled and turned red. She had a fever. Jacob spent money they did not have on a doctor who lanced the infection and told her to rest. She went back to sewing the next day because they could not afford for her to stop. The infection came back weeks later. This time it spread up her arm. She nearly lost the hand. And even then she kept working, one-handed, because the family needed every penny she could earn. But here is what makes this even worse. The contractors and factory owners who controlled this system knew exactly what they were doing. They deliberately structured payment to keep workers on the edge of survival. If they paid too little, workers would die or flee, and they would lose their labor force. But if they paid too much, workers might save money, gain independence, and refuse exploitative conditions. So they calculated the minimum payment that would keep families alive and desperate. It was not accidental. It was not market forces. It was a deliberate strategy to maintain total control over human beings by keeping them perpetually on the brink of starvation. Now think about this. Right now, in this moment, millions of people around the world are working in similar conditions. Garment workers, factory workers, agricultural workers. They work for wages that barely cover survival. They cannot refuse because their families depend on them. Has anything fundamentally changed? Or have we just outsourced the suffering to places where we do not have to see it? Most workers in this system did not last more than 10 or 15 years before their bodies completely broke down. Jacob lasted 9 years. By the time he was 43, his hands were so damaged he could barely hold a needle. His fingers were twisted from arthritis and repetitive strain. His eyesight had deteriorated to the point where he could not see well enough to make the precise stitches required. His back pain was so severe he could not sit for more than an hour without needing to lie down. He was used up, broken, no longer profitable. The contractor stopped giving him work and found a younger, healthier family to exploit. Jacob tried to find other work, but no one would hire a man with twisted hands and failing eyes. His wife tried to take on more sewing herself, but she was also breaking down. Their children, now teenagers, found work in factories, and the family survived on their wages. Jacob, who had worked himself into disability trying to provide for them, was now dependent on them. The role reversal crushed him. He felt useless. He felt like a burden. He stopped eating regularly because he believed his children needed the food more. He faded slowly over the next 2 years. Jacob died at 45. The official cause was pneumonia, but the real cause was a lifetime of exploitation that destroyed his body and left him with no reserves to fight illness. His family could not afford a proper burial. He was interred in a potter's field with no marker. The contractor who had employed him for 9 years did not attend, did not send condolences, just moved on to the next desperate family. Jacob's children continued working in factories. His wife took in laundry, and the system that killed Jacob kept functioning because there were always more people desperate enough to accept its terms. Society needed cheap clothing. The growing middle and upper classes wanted affordable, fashionable garments. Department stores wanted inventory they could sell at competitive prices. That demand was met by people like Jacob who worked themselves to death in tenements and sweatshops for pennies per piece. Every coat, every shirt, every dress sold in those stores represented hours of human suffering that no one wanted to think about. Jacob made those coats so someone else could wear them. He destroyed his body so the economy could function smoothly, and society gave him nothing in return except poverty and an early grave. The system eventually changed, but only after decades of labor organizing, strikes, and tragedies that were too large to ignore. Workplace regulations were passed. Minimum wages were established. Child labor was restricted, but those changes came too late for Jacob and the thousands like him who were used up and discarded before protections existed. They suffered so future generations would not have to endure the same conditions. Jacob is gone now. The tenement where he worked has been demolished. The coats he sewed have long since worn out and been thrown away, but the principle he lived and died by remains relevant. When survival depends entirely on work, when there is no safety net and no alternative, people will accept any conditions, endure any suffering, sacrifice any part of themselves to keep their families alive. Jacob could not refuse. Refusing meant watching his children starve. So he worked until his body gave out. And then the system replaced him and moved on as if he had never existed. If you think piece rate sewing was the only job that trapped families in this way, there were others. Jobs where refusing meant immediate destitution. Jobs where entire families were consumed. Jobs where the choice was never really a choice at all. And some of those systems are still operating right now.